Ms. Frost?
Here.
Dr. Marshall?
Here.
Mr. Stavros is here, is temporarily stepped aside from the meeting. Mr. Temple is not here. Mr. Chair, you have a quorum.
Could you read the committee members again, please?
The members of the Audit Committee are Mr. Edwards, Mrs. Frost, Dr. Marshall, Mr. Stavros, Vice Chair Mr. Temple, Chair Mr. Tripp.
Okay, thank you. The next order of business is approval of the minutes for the January 28, 2010 meeting of the Audit and Compliance Committee. Do I have a motion?
Move approval.
Second?
Second.
All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? That passed. All right, Derry. Next item is approval of the Audit and Compliance Committee Charter in Office of the Inspector General and Director of Compliance Charter Annual Review. Just to briefly tell you that each year we review the charter that we put in place to make sure that it's updated and so that everybody's aware of the fact that that's how we're operating. The changes that Derry and the staff have made this year are basically technical in nature. Derry, is there anything you need to go over on those?
Just 2 points very briefly, Chair Tripp and members of the committee. First of all, in order to meet the provisions of the charter, we not only reviewed it, staff, with the Board of Governors, we submitted it for review as we did with the charter when we were going through the adoption process to interested parties, general counsels, state university, internal auditors, etc. We received very limited comments, but we wanted to continue the process that we felt was successful in the initial adoption of the charter, that is, establish a cooperative and collaborative process so that we could get input. And in that regard, echo what Chair Tripp has said. The changes in the charter this year reflect two things. First, the responsibility of the Audit Committee to reflect upon and assess whether the charter is in fact meeting the objectives that the board has set forth in setting out your duties and responsibilities, and also making sure there are clear lines of authority between the Audit Committee and the Inspector General's office. But in addition to that, making sure that the charter, if it needed any changes at all, in fact was being assessed to ensure that it was adequately reflecting the wishes of the board and the Audit Committee. And in that regard, we have, and you'll see in some of the comments I'm going to make about some of our activities, it has done so. There is one change I'd point out, just to be somewhat detailed. The Audit Committee charter is on page 10 behind your tab for our committee. The Office of Inspector General charter starts at page 21 through 33, and it was a suggestion of Chair Tripp that we change the language so that it was not specifically reflected that we should have 4 meetings, but have 4 meetings, but have meetings as needed, either face-to-face or conference call. With that, I think I would submit to the Audit Committee that a motion to approve those particular changes would be adequate, and there would be no need for any board action since there aren't any substantive changes in duties, responsibilities, or, in this particular instance, directions to the Inspector General.
Okay. Is there any questions regarding this matter? All right. Can I call for a motion to approve? Second?
Second.
All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All right, Derry. The next thing, Derry has been working on an Audit and Compliance Committee handbook, and he'll talk to us briefly on that.
In your packets, you should have a draft of a document, the Audit and Compliance Committee handbook, and this is a draft. It's gone through several iterations, of course, with internally and with the staff, even though we are going to have some additional time. We got to the point in time specifically that we needed input from the Audit Committee as to whether it would serve and is adequately serving the 2 primary objectives. First of all, we realized that there were going to be several new members of both our committee and the board, so the handbook is designed to reflect and to put in one place all of the core documents that are necessary for you to have not only an understanding, but specifically if you also need it as a reference to provide you with those documents in one place. So those dual purposes to serve for new members and existing members is, of course, to provide for new members in one place all of the pertinent documents necessary to reflect the authority, duties, and responsibilities. And just two highlights, and I know we have limited time. First of all, the charters, of course, and we have, if you'll look at the table of contents, what we would ask you to do is take this home, take a look at it. It's kind of a large file. We can send it to you electronically if you'd like, but make sure that we've included those elements that you think would be necessary to meet those two primary objectives. Of course, we have our Constitution, the Charter, the committee's work plan. We left that at just the dashboard level because we are going to come up at the chair's request with a new format for our work plan. But the Audit Committee dashboard does reflect the particular projects, plan completion dates for the committee throughout the year. And I dare say, and you'll hear me say this when I go through the brief presentation on two of our major projects, we're going to have to adjust some of those particular plan completion dates. In addition to that, we thought it would be helpful for new members and existing members to have, because you do have the responsibility for oversight of the Office of Inspector General, the Office of Inspector General Charter, and the statute that I'm required to follow and is applicable to my office. Now, these are kind of dense legal documents, but again, as a reference tool, they'll be helpful. And it was our suggestion to, of course, add an organizational chart of senior staff for your assistance and also biographies. In the final version, our suggestion is that this be a printed document with tabs, but before we went to the expense of doing that, we produced a limited, what I call, I hate to use the word, but it is true, dummy copies for us to review very carefully before we put it to print.
All right, thank you. Members, if you will review this, and I will ask Derry in a couple of weeks' time to contact you personally and see if you have any questions regarding the document, and then we'll try to incorporate those suggestions, any questions that you have into it, and we'll bring it back to our next meeting and we'll approve it. I'd like it's important that the Chancellor also give his approval on it so that you agree and that you've bought into it, and then we will get it printed, and that will become the next step so that we'll have something that anybody can see that tells us how this committee will operate. So I appreciate that. Next thing is we're going to have a discussion led by Derry on the procedures for monitoring university audit reports. Let me give you a little background. Right now things are quiet, and I hope they stay quiet for a long time. But every now and then something breaks loose that brings this committee to the forefront, unfortunately, and it usually has to do with something that hits the newspaper, hits the political situation or something, and so we become very active. One of the things that we have now, I believe, gotten agreement on by being inclusive and having all of the university personnel who deal with audit and compliance, et cetera, meeting with Derry and talking with us, is the fact that they now recognize that the Board of Governors has the responsibility to review all of the audits that are directed at each university, okay? And we must collect those audits. The universities are required to give those to us, and then we need to review those and be comfortable as a board that the system is operating the way it should. What happens is, if something goes wrong, the legislature looks to us immediately about why aren't you watching what's going on? Well, the reality is we have maybe 1.5 people on staff that is able to do that. So we must work with each university, with each inspector general at the university, to make sure that they're doing the job. We would be the last backstop, you might say, and if this comes, but we will probably be the first place they talk to. It will be the call to the Chancellor, and saying, how did this happen? Whatever. So the purpose of this is now to put together a program so we all understand and the universities understand what our role will be in monitoring these audits. Derry?
Well said. I'll go through this quickly. I was wondering if you've seen any other PowerPoint presentations during the last 2 days or so, and whether you're really excited about seeing this particular one. What I've said, and I did so at our January meeting, is that the Audit and Compliance Committee is the most important committee of the Board of Governors. Now, I know that I would have some, let's just say, other remarks or some people, but I think I can make a case for that. But Chair Tripp has outlined really one of the reasons why that case could be made, whether it would be a successful case or not. What the Audit and Compliance Committee Charter, which was adopted in March of 2009, did is specifically set forth the duties and responsibilities of the Audit Committee delegated by the Board to demonstrate accountability, to foster an environment within the state university system that in fact has an emphasis on physical, sound management, integrity, efficiency, etc. What I want to do very briefly, though, is show you that while we're in the process of trying to complete 2 projects, one, to formalize the way that we go about monitoring and reviewing the information we already receive, also grapple with the issues necessary to make a recommendation to this committee and to the full board for a compliance program for the board office and a compliance program for the State University System of Florida. So, having said that, I'll move forward. What are the, well, I'll go back if I can. I picked this title, and you will see that a lot of this is a refresher for those of you who were at the January meeting. But for our new members, I'll spend just a little bit of time talking about what the role of the Audit Committee is, especially in the areas of monitoring, oversight, and compliance. Now, the Audit Committee Charter has specific responsibilities for the State University System and for the Board Office. These are just some of them. Of course, receiving and reviewing university audit reports, identifying trends in such reports, confirming that those trends are in fact, if they're adverse findings, being addressed by the universities, and as you can see, initiating inquiries if the committee has, and I put emphasis on this, reasonable cause to believe a university board of trustees is unwilling or unable to provide a response to audit findings. There's another one that I wanted to talk about again today, and that is this, per the charter, as we have discussed, directing the Inspector General in those instances where investigations have been undertaken or they haven't, to determine if in a particular instance a University Board of Trustees is unwilling or unable to do so. This board reserves the responsibility to take a review of that action and determine if there have been violations of policies, procedures, etc. I'll get this to work. Now, what are the types of audits received? Again, I had 2 objectives in preparing the presentation. We're talking about developing a compliance program, but in fact, compliance is going on all the time. Here are just some examples of the kinds of steps that we're taking in the office right now. The chair has already described many of them. The financial and operational audits conducted by the Auditor General, that is, of all 11 universities, there's a financial audit done each year on an annual basis. Of course, it's fiscal year review, and also operational audits every 2 years. Those are submitted to us. The final final reports are submitted to all members. We receive them and review each one. What you may not know is that we also receive audited financial statement reports of direct support organizations, health support organizations, and also Form 990s for both of those organizations. I left out of the slide the fact that we also receive audited financial statements for faculty practice plans. Now, this is both due to our particular regulation, that is the board's own regulation, and also consistent with the statute. We review each of those financial statements. A financial statement, again, using a simplistic definition, is a snapshot of the financial condition of an institution or organization. We review those to determine whether or not it's a qualified or unqualified opinion, and if there is a management letter, whether there's any particular action that we take. And I'll go into that maybe a little bit more later. We also receive audits of federal awards, contracts, and grants. That's very important. These are required by the Florida Single Audit Act, and they're conducted again by the Auditor General. And of each of our 11 universities who receive funds in each of these particular areas. Internal audit reports. Prior to the adoption of the charter and the adoption of the powers and duties regulation, the internal audit groups at each of the universities, which are active, mature internal audit groups, were submitting on an ad hoc basis their internal audit reports. Now, I don't want to keep you from lunch, but I am an advocate, of course, of the value of an internal audit process, because in an internal audit function, the management team, while it does not conduct the audit, it can direct the auditors by reviewing the audit plan, that is by the trustees of that particular university, into those areas which are highest risk. So we needed to come up with a specific statement by this board that we also wanted to capture that information. It's extremely valuable. All 11 universities have, as I said, mature, operating internal auditors who are doing some fine work. In addition to that, how are we going to do it? The Board of Governors has, as you have seen in all of the annual reports, a very sophisticated management information system. We call it the data request system. You have reviewed in the last 3 days lots of the data collected in that system. The reason I mention that is that in order to try to track, which is part of monitoring, much less try to identify trends, we have decided and have developed, which is in your packet of materials, a data request, so that those internal audit reports, once they become final, will be sent to the Board of Governors electronically each quarter. Now, I will admit, I have reviewed the internal audit reports that we've received since the powers and duties regulation was passed. It will be a significant amount of data and information, because again, we're talking about 11 universities, we're talking about internal audit groups which have, well, in some instances, significant staff, but in each instances, they are doing very detailed reviews in those areas that they have determined are the highest risk at their universities. I'm excited about the prospect, but also understand, as Chair Tripp has pointed out, that we have a very real challenge in how we're going to utilize that information and come up with a way to get the information you need back to you in a form and a fashion that you can use.
Jerry,
Also, of course,
let me make one comment. So it's clear, we do not intend to have input with the 11 universities as how do they direct their internal audits. And we don't want that to come across that that's what we're trying to do. What we're doing is, when those audits are completed, Derry and our people are looking at the final results of those audits, and we're looking to see if there are any disturbing trends in those audits. At that point, I would hope that Derry would be comfortable to go back to their Inspector General or Auditor General and have a discussion with them regarding those issues. But I want to make sure it's absolutely clear that we're not going to be in the forefront of how these audits take place. Is that correct, Derry?
Yes, that is correct. Now, as the Inspector General for the Board of Governors, I will be conducting, and have to by statute, developing a risk assessment, and we're going through that process now in an audit plan. And again, we'll talk about resources in my closing remarks, develop an opportunity to review some aspects of the board operations. That is, of course, again, a responsibility of this committee to oversee board operations. But
that's
correct.
Within our board, not
Yes,
not at the individual university level.
And the way that I've tried to describe it in previous discussions, many with the members of the committee and also with Chair Tripp, and of course the Chancellor is very prominent in this particular discussion. We do have a system and we do have a fiduciary responsibility for the overall management. The question in our particular area is, how do you implement that in such a fashion that this board gets the information that it needs to make decisions, respecting our governance structure, which puts the primary responsibility for day-to-day operations where it should be on the university boards of trustees.
Right.
So I'll try not to get too long-winded about that, but that is a challenge from my perspective. We follow up with universities on audit findings and corrective actions. By that, we've already developed a formal process where we will contact usually the internal auditor there. We'll make sure that staff are aware of the particular findings. We've done that with the operational audits that have been issued this year. And as I said, where I think we have added value in the last year is being able to have very, very good relationships and communications with the Chancellor and senior staff on particular internal controls. That is, I cannot develop an internal control, a policy, or procedure, but we are very active in discussing those and making comments and suggestions about how they might be improved. And that is going on each and every day. Why is that important? Because we do not have a systematic program, broadly defined, which we could call a compliance program by most criteria. But we have the charge to develop one and make a recommendation to this board as to what makes sense for both the board office and the state university system. I put this definition up because I think it's very good. Many of you have been on boards before. You've been involved as either attorneys, et cetera, with Sarbanes-Oxley, with the sentencing guidelines, but this definition is almost lifted from the sentencing guidelines, which have been around forever. The point that I always make when I use this particular definition is that everybody is doing compliance. All of our universities have, again, very active compliance activities each and every day in all particular areas, not just in athletics, but in those operational areas where they know that there is a mix of specific policy, rules, regulations, and laws. You've already talked about them. But in this particular instance, what we have discussed is whether to develop a compliance program that meets some of the definitions and also some of the particular factors that have been determined over the years to result in the ability to meet this definition. That is, to develop a program that will detect violations of law. And if I can slow down for a moment, in my previous job when I was a full-time lawyer with a company, part of what we said we did in representing the company is practice what we call preventive law. And again, being somewhat simplistic, but also getting to the point. What we're talking about in a compliance program is trying to systemize a review under sound standards, risk assessment, monitoring, of course taking in complaints, et cetera, and investigating them, and corrective action plans that will help an organization ensure that they are meeting their responsibilities here. Now, in January, we had the opportunity to talk about the Brogan Doctrine, and I keep on asking Chancellor Brogan, okay, did I get this right? But when he came on board, I wanted to talk to him and to the chair and members of the committee. What is the board's role? This graphic, and I won't spend too much time on it, is a fairly straightforward, here are your steps to develop a compliance program. I'll emphasize only two things, well, three. First, we had no problem in identifying a project owner or champion between Chair Tripp and Chancellor Brogan, who's not only been the president of a university, but has been in state government and government for many years. They understand the necessity of having a systematic way of getting to the bottom of issues and getting them resolved. The Brogan Doctrine simply, as we talked about, and I'll let the Chancellor chime in if he wants to, is that the board does retain the fiduciary responsibility for the overall management, respecting, again, the governance structure that we have. The governance structure in our system is different than any system that I can find in the United States in terms of those kinds of issues. And in that particular instance, that doesn't mean that we can't go through the other steps, that is, identify those objectives that we think are key, prioritize them, and eventually, as it says in box 4, come up with a systematic compliance program that involves or includes training, monitoring, identifying areas of noncompliance, and my favorite, corrective action plan process. And that's what we're undertaking right now. We had some fun with this particular slide because how complex are you talking about? Well, put it simply, it can get a little sticky because not only are the laws changing, but this board has gone through its own governance, both transitions. I use as a specific example the agreement that we reached with the legislature on particular issues. We have to comply, and now we have to make changes in our own policies and regulations. But I'll focus only on the one out over there, BOG regulations, et cetera. The board speaks through its regulations. You just reviewed 2 new regulations which were noticed, and that is why it was easy for us to identify that as being an area where we should focus our review. In developing, if I can go back one slide, a compliance matrix. Our compliance matrix is probably not going to be just in neat little boxes like that, but we will have, when we finish this process, a whole list of statutes and other policies and procedures that we have to follow. But we are also, when I say we, the Board of Governors and this board, responsible for promulgating regulations which require action by the board and action by the universities. So in developing our review of and systematic review of a compliance program, we decided to look first at the regulations. Now, when I say we, it was discussions with the chancellor, with the chair, with our general counsel, and with senior staff. The regulation compliance project, as those bullets show you, is our attempt to review all 89 and soon to be 91 of the 2 regulations proposed today. What we have done, though, is we've come up with a compliance process involving a steering committee made up of members of the staff. We're looking at each of the regulations and in a particular methodology which will meet, I think, certain very good standards. We're analyzing those. Now, we started the process back in last fall. We also are including it as part of the risk assessment process to develop our audit plan, but we have also reviewed those particular regulations which are already in place. What I said at the January meeting, I'll say again today. What we want to do first is focus on what do the regulations say are the actions to be taken by the board, and what do the regulations say are the actions to be taken by the state university system. Because at the end of this process, as you see, my office will review those report and make recommendations. What we're focusing on is do we have and do we need to improve our implementation of those particular policies, procedures, or in this particular instance, are we in fact having a mature internal control system that has policies and procedures to implement all of our regulations. Now, the BOG Compliance Steering Committee, as I said, is made up of several members of the senior staff. We've turned them into compliance analysts. The SUS Compliance Work Group is comprised of representatives from 4 universities, UCF and the General Counsel, the internal auditor, Chief Audit Executive from USF and their Chief Compliance Officer, FIU's Chief Compliance Officer, and Florida A&M University's Audit and Compliance Officer. In this particular instance, that group will assist my office and our staff in trying to develop a recommendation for the establishment of the program. Oops. Do I have any questions? Because I'm done.
Any questions of the committee? Okay. Gary, anything else?
Chair Tripp, so what are our next steps? And what will the board have to grapple with in terms of dealing with some of these issues? Just a few. First of all, is it a centralized or decentralized program? That is, who will be, in this particular instance, reviewing those particular trends, et cetera, and how will we identify them? And one of the few that I want to emphasize, and I didn't overlook it, I just left it for last, is we have to have resources in order to conduct any of these things. So in each of the instances where the universities have decided how they're going to handle compliance, I think it's extremely important for this committee and for the board to hear from them. So I've discussed with Chair Tripp inviting at least 1 or 2 of them to make presentations the next time we can meet face to face, so you can find out what issues they've grappled with in trying to determine how you can leverage existing resources or add resources, and what is the return on doing so.
And to reiterate, what we're trying to make sure we do is that we're inclusive with the universities, because they are the frontline defense on all of this. And basically, what we're trying to put together is a plan in which each of the universities and their personnel are comfortable that it assists them and better prepares them in their compliance areas. So we do not want to drive it from the top down. We want it to be across the board, all of the universities working with the Board of Governors, and really giving us some much needed assistance, because it's very important that we rely on their resources. Is that correct?
That's correct, sir. And I'll end with just this. 300,000+ students, thousands of faculty, et cetera. Our key constituencies, as I've sometimes articulated, the public, the legislature, and those students and alumni are going to expect us to be able to demonstrate that we are accountable, and this board is active and engaged. That is not an issue. The real challenge for us as staff is presenting to you a format, an approach that will meet your particular level of need to receive information and to have it in such a fashion that you can make decisions when necessary. That's all I have.
Okay. Any questions? Hearing none, thank you. I just want to make sure that the minutes are clear that we approved 2 things. that we approve the Audit and Compliance Committee Charter and Office of the Inspector General and Director of Compliance Charter. And there was another section in there, Derry. Did I get all of the language? That's what I want to make sure.
Yes, sir. There was no need for a motion on any other items there.
Okay.
The rest was just a report.
And approval of the Inspector General and Director of Compliance Charter Annual Review. Okay, fine. Do I have anything from the committee?
Just a question, Governor Tripp. As part of this handbook we received, there's something that says Board of Governors Master Powers and Duties. Is that distributed to every Board of Governors? Every member of the Board of Governors?
When we get the compliance handbook, though, I mean, we might want to give it to everybody.
Well, that was my comment.
Chairwoman, do you think we should send this out to everybody?
Yes.
I would recommend that, because in there it says, for example, review annually the Chancellor's performance. Did you hear that, Chancellor Brogan?
How am I doing?
Doing fine.
Meeting
Yeah, I think
adjourned.
everybody should receive it.
Okay. Derry,
Yes, sir.
would you
That
make
was the
sure
plan.
that all board members receive it?
They will.
And make sure you make contact with each board member now for their comments.
I will do so.
Okay?
Thank
you. Anything further? Motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Stand adjourned. Thank you.
Lunch is in the same place as yesterday.
Lunch, same spot as yesterday.
And when do you
As it stands right now, I think it's about 12 o'clock. If we could start back at 12:45, I'd appreciate that. Thank you very much. I'm sorry. Governor
UCF
Beer?
has agreed to give anybody a quick tour of the campus.
Yeah, there's a